In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. As I was reflecting on this gospel passage yesterday afternoon, against the backdrop these days of the coronavirus, I was struck in the passage about how much anxiety there is in this passage, and how it's true that anxiety is contagious. So not just the coronavirus or various viruses, material, biological, but also human anxiety itself is contagious. And I found it interesting how Jesus dealt with the contagiousness of this anxiety in the passage. You know, I was studying recently, I was at a very interesting seminar that was describing a psychological theory called Bowen family systems theory. And according to this theory, anxiety is produced within these family systems. And family can be defined as we conventionally define it, but it also could be defined as something larger. It could be defined as a group of friends. It could be defined as a church family. And that within these families, so to speak, they're closed systems. And anxiety is produced in response to stressors. And what happens is that sometimes individuals within the system who produce a lot of anxiety in response to this stressor will attempt to offload it onto other people within the society, within this kind of family system. And so, whether knowingly or unknowingly, usually unknowingly, and so this anxiety becomes kind of contagious, and it affects the entire system. So that if, for example, and I think we all know this, that if one of the parents comes home and has had a stressful day at work and perhaps isn't in a good mood, that anxiety immediately transfers itself to other members in the household. Maybe the child will start to be upset about something, or the mother will absorb that anxiety from the father and then take it out on the child who's misbehaving. So it was against this was kind of all in the background of my mind when I looked at the passage, this gospel reading yesterday. And what's the stressor in this case? It begins with the stressor is that Lazarus, a dear friend of Jesus and the disciples, as is his whole family, Martha and Mary, his sisters, Lazarus is ill. And so the sisters, Mary and Martha, send a message to Jesus, who was, it appears, about a day's journey away, about 20 miles away. And they send a message to him, and they say, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And in the ancient world, this was, much like today, a polite way of saying, "Please come do something about this." They don't ask him specifically to do something, but this was the kind of polite way, and this is how it would be understood. "Lord, he whom you love is ill." And Jesus delays 2 days longer. He delays 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go into Judea again." Judea, Jesus was from the northern part, the north of Israel. And Judea in the south was where Jerusalem was. It's where all the religious authority was and where all the hostility and enmity toward Jesus was. And so when Jesus says, "Let us go into Judea again," in other words, in order to visit Lazarus and the sisters, the disciples, now they have anxiety. The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were but now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" In other words, because they feared, possibly, we hope that they feared for Jesus, but if they really understood who he was, they wouldn't fear. But we know that they didn't really understand who he was at this point. What they're really afraid about is that they're going to have to go with him. They're going to have to go into Judea with him. And finally, this truth comes out when Thomas finally says, "Brothers, let's go to Judea with him and die with him." So there's this anxiety produced, again, by this stressor among the disciples. And Jesus decides, "We're going." And so they go and head toward Bethany, which is about 3 kilometers, mile and a half east of Jerusalem. And as Jesus is approaching, Martha hears that he's approaching, and she runs out to him. She runs out and says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So immediately she wants to offload this anxiety that she has onto Jesus. He's not even in the door yet. She runs out to meet him, to tell him this. She's accusing him. In other words, why didn't you act when I told you to act? And I wonder if maybe some of our own anxiety comes from this. That when we are faced with a stressor, such as the coronavirus now, that we ask, why isn't God acting? I've asked politely. I've prayed nicely. Just like the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "He who you love is ill." But he didn't do anything. And this causes a frustration within us. God is not acting as we told him to. God is not acting as we wished. And so Martha too is frustrated. She says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Then her sister, interestingly, when it's her sister's turn, Mary also goes out to him and she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So she too had absorbed all this anxiety in response to the stress of her brother dying. And she's pouring it out on Jesus. They want God to act now. They love Jesus. Jesus is a dear friend, a part of their family. They could be considered disciples of Jesus, but they too don't understand who he is. They know that he's a man of God, but they've put him in this nice, neat little box in which he's supposed to act like they tell him to act. When they push the button, this result is supposed to happen. And when God doesn't act like we want him to in our little box that we've created for him, then we're angry, we're upset, we're anxious with him and with others. So what does Jesus say in response to Martha? He said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." What does that mean? She's saying, yeah, I know that. Because this was a kind of staple belief among the Pharisees and many of the groups of Judaism at that time, the exception being the Sadducees, the priestly group, denied that there would be a resurrection. And so Martha is simply acknowledging, it's like for us, we say that in the creed every Sunday. I know that. Yeah, I believe in the resurrection. Jesus said to her, so she says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." Can you imagine that? She's rolling along. She's telling Jesus, she's telling God what he's supposed to do for her. He questions her. He's saying, "Don't you know that he's going to rise again? Why are you so anxious?" Just like then we recall the scene, the glimpse we get into Martha and Mary from the Gospel of St. Luke. This is from St. John, but in St. Luke, he gives us a window into their lives. And what does he do there? Again, Martha is sharing her anxiety with Jesus. "Lord, don't you care that my sister is not helping me prepare?" And he says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. You have need. One thing is needful. One thing." So the same here. He's calming her down. "Don't you know that your brother will rise again?" And she says, yeah, I know that. And Jesus says to her, "I am the resurrection and the life." He's trying to get her attention. What a revelation he makes to her. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? He's very direct with her. Do you believe this? And now, it's like a slap in the face. Now she's come to herself. Now she's let go of this anxiety for a second, and she's paying attention to Jesus, who is standing in front of her and talking to her directly. He got her attention finally. She's paying attention to what Jesus is saying. And she says to him this all-important line, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world." This is the confession of faith of the early church. Just as Peter in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke makes this same confession of faith at the crucial turning point in those Gospels, Here, Martha makes it at the crucial turning point in the Gospel of John. She makes the confession of faith that every Christian should. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now who he is. Now she gets it. He is the Messiah, the anointed one. He is the Son of God, and he will not act according to her whims. He will act as God. He is the resurrection and the life. So now she comes to believe, and now she allows, the situation is diffused. Jesus then goes and says the same thing to Mary, her sister. He calms their anxiety. He gains their belief. He gets their focus on him. They've blocked out all this panic that's being stirred up around them. He's got their focus on him. He's got their attention. He's got them calmed down. And now he goes and calls Lazarus out of the grave. This is the lesson, I think, for us today, brothers and sisters. Now, as we are entering into our own Holy Week in the midst of great panic and anxiety all around us, within our own families, within our own social groupings. And we do. This is not to say we don't have to be concerned and have to take care, but we don't have to have anxiety about it. We don't have to absorb this anxiety from everyone else. What we need to do is let Jesus get our attention. Let's look at Jesus this week. Starting today, let's focus on Jesus and block out the anxiety. We still do what we have to do. We still have to follow the rules. We still have to be cautious, but we don't have to have anxiety about it. And we certainly don't have to make it contagious so that we're infecting others around us. Let's focus on Jesus. And when we meet his gaze, a calm will come, and then the miracle can come. I'll end with the reading from Hebrews, which is also talking about anxiety. The epistle we read before the gospel. There, St. Paul says, "Be content with what you have, for he has said," he's quoting scripture, the Lord has said, "I will never fail you nor forsake you." Hence, we can confidently say, "The Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me?" I will not be afraid. I will not have anxiety. And he says at the beginning of the letter, "Let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For our God is a consuming fire." He is an all-powerful God. He hears our pleas, and he will act at the time that he chooses for our good. In the meantime, let's focus on him, and let's offer him acceptable worship with reverence and awe. Amen.